Okay, can everyone see my screen? Cool. Okay, I'm gonna interpret that as a yes. Okay, so this is the Jan-Feb topic lecture. I'm Sarah. I'm a junior at Greenhill, and I've been debating for 4 years, and this is over the treaties topic. Okay, so for those of you who don't know the resolution, it's resolved the United States ought to become party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea and or the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So, for some context, we can go over a brief overview of what both treaties are, and then the rest of this lecture will be divided into broadly two parts. First, I'll talk about the Law of the Sea Treaty, and then I'll dive into the ICC. So, both halves of the resolution are pretty separate, which is why I'm keeping the lecture pretty separate. There's only like a little bit of overlap in terms of critical areas of the literature, like the IRK. So, I'll be talking about most of the affirmative and negative ground separately. So, what is UNCLOS? UNCLOS stands for the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it is an international agreement that establishes a legal framework for both marine and maritime activities between states and countries. So it's basically a constitution for the oceans. So when you think of affirmative and negative ground with respect to the law of the sea, there is an extremely wide range of literature. So there's basically it's anything to do with ocean governance. The ICC stands for the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, and it's a permanent international court with the purpose of investigating, prosecuting, or trying individuals accused of committing atrocity crimes. These things include genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes, and also crimes of aggression. So there are like very two separate halves of the topic. If you want to talk about ocean governance and maritime agreements, there's one half of the topic for you, and if you want to talk about like courts and the law, there's another half, and these two are like pretty separate. Okay, so more context. I want to start with topicality because it's great. It defines the division of affirmative and negative ground. It details what AFs can do, but more importantly, what they can't do. So the first thing that we should probably define is the United States. In the context of this resolution, it should probably be interpreted as the USFG because in the context of international relations, the executive branch has most of the power. The next term is become party to. There are multiple meanings of this word. It could be either partial or complete ratification or like accession. In most meanings, it means that member states, quote, consent to be bound by the treaty, which means that treaties have to be entirely legally binding, which is useful for process competition and decide debates. The next two term is the two treaties, which I already covered before, the definitions of them. This part of the resolution is pretty cut and dry. There are just like two treaties that exist, and there is not much room for reinterpretation of them unless you're running to more like critical sides of the literature. But in terms of policy debates, there's not much reinterpretation. The last term to define is and or, and this is the topicality interpretation that I've seen in most 1 and Cs so far in this topic. I've inserted evidence to the right, and it basically says that affirmatives have to defend both treaties under the mandate of the plan. And it says that the correct interpretation of the topic is one that reads the term and or in its conjunctive use, but not its disjunctive use. This interpretation is like pretty intuitively very bad and horrible for debates, and it is pretty clear why. It forces affirmative teams to split the 1AC in half with two disjointed advantages and makes it pretty easy in the 1 and C to pick out of one half of the topic and then read a disadvantage to the other half. And it would make the time trade-off for the 1AC and the 1AR a negative one, and it would be pretty untenable. This is also probably why I've seen like no 2 Rs on this argument, but it is certainly one that exists, and you should keep in mind when making 1ARs for your AFs. The next argument that I think will become more relevant as the topic goes on and as affirmative specification gets crazier is Tea Party. There has been one AF that I've seen so far that attempts to do partial ratification of the law of the Sea Treaty, but it is pretty widely considered literature consensus that there cannot be reservations under either treaty. So neither the Rome Statute nor the law of the Sea Treaty. I think this interpretation of the topic gets a little dicey for example, there's 301 distinct articles underneath the Law of the Sea Treaty, which means that under an interpretation where affirmatives could defend any of them, there would be 301 distinct affirmative advocacies, probably a little less, because the topic is obviously decently functionally limited. But the other interpretation would mean that affirmatives would only get to defend the Law of the Sea or the ICC, which is just two AF plan texts, which could also be pretty bad for affirmative innovation. So I'm curious to see what AF teams decide to do closer to the TOC in the postseason when app innovation becomes inevitable. The last argument that I've seen is sort of theory arguments. which is an argument, which is like a spec argument, which exists on every topic. I don't think this is a particularly good one, but it's spec become party to. It's just another argument about specification on the topic that the term become party to is vague and that affirmative should specify what it is. I think it's pretty easy to get out of these debates because the term is actually not that vague. It pretty much means that you have to just be consent to be bound by the treaty in its entirety and become a member nation to it. Okay, so the rest of this lecture will be divided into two parts. So I'm going to start with the law of the sea half of the topic. This half of the topic is where I've seen considerably the most of the topic literature and AF innovation. And my prediction is that it's going to largely stay this way for the next 4 months because the literature is just way better here. So a brief overview. First, UNCLOS was established in 1944 with 168 signatories to it by the United Nations, even though the United Nations has no full official role in the implementation of the laws and guidelines that are set by the treaty, it's left to the International Maritime Organization, the International Whaling Commission, and the International Seabed Authority. So these are the ones who actually enforce the rules and have punishments for breaking them. So the treaty basically governs internal waters, the territorial sea, the archipelagic waters, the contiguous zone, exclusive economic zones, continental shelf, high seas, and the area. So these are all terms that the United Nations has coined to divide the ocean into distinct parts based off of its usage. And these terms might be jargony. Only a few of them are relevant. I would say are the territorial sea, the exclusive economic zone, which I'll get to later, and the area. The area is basically a part of the ocean that describes the intermittent areas between countries that no one has ownership over. It's just the international waters. And there are a lot of resources there that are disputed over because no one really owns them. The fourth point is that states who are members of the treaty have complete access to 12 nautical miles off of their coast, which is called their territorial sea. They can basically do whatever they want there, have military ships prowling there. They can get resources from those seas. And most states also have access to their contiguous zones, which is 24 miles off of their coasts. The United States is not signatory to UNCLOS officially, but it recognizes it as customary international law, or CIL, which is probably a familiar term to most of you, which limits our obligation to the treaty because we're not officially members of it, but we recognize that those articles are important. We follow them for the most part. This is pretty important because it could thump most disads, but it could also mean that most AF advantages are non-inherent. So it's a double-edged sword, and it is an important part of the literature for AF teams to parse through. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about in our overview is the idea of an exclusive economic zone. So this is an area of an ocean that extends about 200 nautical miles beyond a territorial sea, where coastal nations can have jurisdiction over what the stuff that goes on there. There's resources that are there, and a lot of UNCLOS articles and guidelines basically regulate who has access to the resources in these exclusive economic zones. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about core AF advantages on the UNCLOS side of the topic. So these are more policy-oriented advantages, but there are a ton of soft left and critical ideas for AFs on the topic, surrounding things like ocean governance, our relationship to the land, the ocean, water, etc. There's a wealth of literature. So the first core advantage that I want to talk about are the mining advantages. There are two versions of this advantage. The better one is that ratifying UNCLOS would increase access to critical mineral resources in disputed territorial sea. So a lot of the United States-based companies currently have the technological resources to engage in things like rigorous mining projects, but they fear a lack of legal protection that they have in the waters, which is what the Law of the Sea Treaty would supposedly give them. The impact to a lot of these advantages are about the tech race with China, which would straight turn a lot of negative arguments about China being emboldened post-accession or post-ratification of the treaty. This is something I'll touch on later, but a lot of really good affirmatives on the topic have UNCLOS key warrants or warrants as to why joining the treaty specifically would resolve the internal links. That is the one thing that would resolve it. And they would also straight turn most important disadvantages, which I think mining advantages are set up to do really nicely. The second type of advantage is China. So China is currently reinterpreting the treaty to increase its access to things like islands and territorial waters and minerals in the SCS. This can be viewed as sort of a loss of maritime security and international credibility for the United States. And therefore, it could spark some sort of conflict with China and lead to US-China war. Another really important thing to keep in mind, and sort of a piece of information that everyone should know, are about the current conflicts between China and the Philippines. So basically, all of these contested areas in the SCS, they exist, and China is sort of bullying the Philippines over it. And the United States is currently in a defense treaty with the Philippines that basically says that we'll come to their rescue if China ever attacks them or whatever. But China sort of justifies these exploits over the United States' hypocrisy surrounding maritime governance. So basically, the United States is like, China, you can't do these crazy things in the SES and like threaten the Philippines. And China is like, no, you're not part of UNCLOS, so you really don't have the credibility to sort of tell us that we are improperly using things like maritime space. And they justify it by United States' refusal to accede to the treaty, if that makes sense. So it's kind of like United States hypocrisy on this issue emboldens China. And that the AF argument is that the United States joining the treaty would remove some of that justification for China. The next type of advantages are the hegemony or the leadership advantages. So there's this really good advocate called the Nevitt or Nevitt card. I've inserted the title on this slide if you want to cut the card. And it talks a little bit about the stuff that I was mentioning above, about how the United States taking a hypocritical stance on the issue of things like maritime governance would be bad for us, and that ratifying the treaty would supposedly enforce US leadership and help us take a stance on climate leadership, sort of demonstrating a committed renewal to international law. The last core advantage that I've seen are Arctic advantages and Arctic AFs. And the Arctic Circle basically is this like really hotly contested area in the north, and there's not really super good division of like who belongs there and who is able to have access to the resources there, especially when it comes to the oceans around it. Russia is currently expanding both militarily and economically in the Arctic, and they have this plan that's called Arctic 2035. And the United States ratifying the treaty would sort of give us more opportunity and more bandwidth to also expand there militarily and maybe check Russian expansion there and prevent Russian acquisition of like increased resources in the Arctic, as well as it makes it easier for the Arctic Council, because we're the last member who hasn't fully acceded to the treaty. It would make it easier for us to submit claims to things like the continental shelf there, which is important for the management of like many resources that exist there. Okay, so what will smart AF debaters keep in mind when crafting their 1ACs? A bit of a disappointing disadvantage on this topic is that unclosed key warrants are really hard to come by. I think I like mentioned it before. The evidence is just not that good. The evidence that is just like unclosed is the one thing that will solve this advantage. Those are really hard to come by. There are definitely some cards that exist, but like most people have already cut those cards. And my feeling is that towards the end of the topic, more like around the postseason and the TOC, these cards will have been recycled so much that affirmative innovation will become way more difficult without having to use those original cards, or that affirmatives that try to innovate more will be lacking a lot of these warrants. So that's just something I want to keep in mind, and that you guys should keep in mind when sort of writing 1ACs, is that it's important to find these cards. The fact that these cards and unclosed key warrants are really weird on this topic means that advantage counterplans are like super good. There are a lot of external things that negative teams can fiat to get rid of AF internal links, which is definitely something we've already seen on this topic. There are like so many advantage counterplans to unclosed AFs. Another thing that AF should keep in mind, and something that I touched on before, is that they should try and preempt and straight turn a lot of disads in the 1AC, which is obviously like just something that a lot of core affirmatives should always try to do. Certainty and immediacy deficits are also, I think, good on this topic, and they should be baked into app advantages, and it's especially good in process debates, so you don't have to like reread certainty and immediacy deficits in the 1AR. There are a lot of good deficits about how joining treaties must be certain, they must be binding, and that the app must be immediate to resolve its internal links. Good AF debaters will also understand how international relations works. You should always do some core reading over things like international relations, understand the core difference between things like liberalism and realism, you understand different IR theories, and just keep up with the news, like on a daily basis, geopolitical news, and it'll make debating the topic so much easier. Just like the military presence topic last year, it's the same thing that applies. Okay, so now the negative side of the topic. There are a bunch of disadvantages to the law of the sea, and the literature for these things is not that bad. In my opinion, I think cards on the negative side of the topic are actually better than AF cards. Okay, so the first is the oil DA. The link argument is that joining the treaty would sort of subject the United States to lawsuits over drilling projects, and that it would eventually incentivize companies to divest away from oil and gas drilling. Litigation, so like increased lawsuits, would increase the chances of things like energy wars. It could increase the chance we would pop the carbon bubble or cause asset stranding from the perception of company fallout. I love the oil dissent. I think it's actually one of the best arguments versus AFs warming impacts, like the mining AFs. And they generally just like happen much quicker and like have a much quicker time frame. Okay, so next is the naval power DA. This argument is basically saying that joining the treaty would subject the United States to more restrictions in terms of freedom of navigation, which would straight turn a lot of advantages that claim that the treaty gives us more naval power. So if any of this stuff like seems confusing because it seems like you can say the same thing when you're either AF or neg, that's like literally the point. The treaty is subject to so much interpretation, which gives a lot of argumentative flexibility on either side of the topic. Okay. Next is the mining DA. Teams can run with a lot. They can say that mining is good or that it's bad or that the plan either stops or increases mining. But I think the best negative argument is that increasing mining would lead to things like environmental concerns. I'll talk about this later. Like I have a whole part of the slideshow dedicated to mining. Okay, another version of the liabilities DA is the military liabilities DA. This basically says the same thing as oil does that, but that the United States would be subject to lawsuits over like maritime navigation in terms of our military, and that would weaken our security commitments to different countries because we would no longer be able to like travel as freely as we do now, and that would erode our assurances. So this is like this topic's version of the assurances disadvantage. It should be familiar to you given the previous topic of the military presence one. Okay, the last asset that I've written on here is China lash out. This argument basically says that Xi Jinping's credibility is low now, and that the United States joining the treaty would take away one of China's biggest core international stages away from them because they are like part of UNCLOS. They use it to justify their navigation in the SES and sort of gain back some of that international legitimacy. China would like take Taiwan, which would escalate. This is another good argument that I've seen, and the cards are generally pretty good. I think the link argument, like there's like this one article, I think it's written by someone named Guan, like Guan 22. And it like very explicitly says the United States joining UNCLOS would cause China to like freak out. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about are some core negative counterplan and PIC ground. Something to establish from the jump is that I don't think PICs are competitive on this topic. My thought process for this is that it is like literally illegal for countries to make reservations underneath the law of the sea treaty, and that in order to make reservations, you need to have another article that expressly permits reservation, if that makes sense. So like you can't like carve out reservations in the treaty itself unless there is another article that exists that is like, yes, you can make this reservation. So if PICs wanted to be legal, they would have to fiat in another article that permits the reservation that they want to make, so permits the exception. But if they did that, then AFs could just permute the plank that fiats in the extra reservation, and then that would still be textually, functionally legitimate. There might be a way for PICs to sort of compete off of immediacy, but I think that is just bad, and that is just like not a debate that you want to get into. So like, for example, if you had a PIC that was like, okay, do join UNCLOS except for the part that's like, we should deep sea mine, and then read a disadvantage to deep sea mining. In order for that to be like a legal action, you would have to join the treaty, fiat in another article that would permit not deep sea mining, and then that's the PIC. So AFs could just permute the plank that's like fiating in an exception, because then that would just be like a permutation to the counterplan would be completely legitimate. Okay. As I've said before, advantage counterplans are also pretty good, and they're something that you should invest time into like creating for negative debates and like having sets of planks that answer core affirmative ground. I think they're just pretty good, and AF deficits are like fake and made up. Another thing that I like about this topic is the room for process innovation. I think this is actually like a much better way to do PICs on this topic. There are so many ways to fiat in conditions on changing random portions of the treaty prior to US accession. So an example of this is like changing, there was a disadvantage about marine genetic resource provisions under UNCLOS. So basically like when companies go out and they collect genetic material at the bottom of the sea to create like pharma and like pharmaceutical innovation, they need patents on it. And UNCLOS requires full information dissemination from companies and member states. So like they have to release all the information about the things they extract. And that would like decrease the value of patents and destroy IP rights, which would destroy pharma innovation. And basically, the conditions counterplan would like condition US accession on changing that part of the treaty. So it would compete off of certainty and immediacy like any other process counterplan, and then have that like fiated in disadvantage, if that makes sense. So a lot of these have the potential to like alter the treaty and have like infinite net benefits that you can choose from. And I think this is a way to like pick out of things, but have it compete more legitimately. A lot of these things also have good net benefits that turn the case, which makes certainty and immediacy deficits way less compelling. And this would not be like a reservation specifically for the United States, so it would compete. It would like literally have like the United Nations alter the treaty. Okay, so some examples also of process counterplans are like unilateral declarations and China conditions, different conditions counterplans that you can create. Okay, so now I wanted to take a little detour from all of the argumentative side of the topic to talk about just like a core argument that I think everyone needs to know a lot about, which is deep sea mining. So the continental shelf, it is the most controversial aspect to UNCLOS, basically relegating like who has authority over it? Do you have resources there? There's so much stuff on the continental shelf. There's like trillions and trillions worth of minerals there, which is why it's really important to figure out access and which countries can do what in different places. UNCLOS is literally about these controversial areas. So if a country wants to mine, UNCLOS gives them the ability to govern what that looks like. It defines the maritime zones there. So there are like three specific things that I want to talk about. Part 11 of the treaty talks about the area, which I talked about above, and the resources, and it basically regulates mineral extraction in the seabed beyond national jurisdiction, which is known as the area. And Article 137 says that no state can claim sovereignty over it, which is why it's beyond national jurisdiction. And Article 140 says that activities must benefit all of humanity, with a special attention to developing countries, which might be something to think about for like AFs in the future, maybe even like a soft left AF. And the International Seabed Authority is the authority that regulates all of these things. They issue licenses, they enforce them, they develop environmental standards, etc. So there are a lot of concerns about deep sea mining, even though it is like largely extremely profitable, and it's really important for things like innovation in the future. There are environmental concerns surrounding it. So deep sea mining threatens deep sea ecosystems by like literally like ruining, like pillaging the bottom of the sea. And it's horrible for biodiversity if it goes unregulated, bad for hydrothermal vents, and they disrupt carbon sinks. So if anyone has like taken an environmental science course, you know about like the carbon cycle. So like carbon travels up in the air and then it gets fixated into like huge carbon sinks in the ocean. The ocean is the largest source, a store of carbon in the world. And deep sea mining directly affects it by disrupting the levels of carbon in the ocean, which are horrible for carbon cycling. So it has impacts on plants on the land, has impacts for us like when we do cellular respiration. So like all of this stuff has like cascading effects, and has the potential to be horrible for biodiversity and even global warming because carbon is important and the carbon cycle has like effects on global warming. It also has issues in terms of equity and access. So deep sea mining obviously benefits the wealthier nations and the corporations that have the ability and the access and the technological capability to literally mine, which sidelines developing countries and places them further at the periphery. Indigenous and coastal communities have also expressed their concerns over deep sea mining, like specifically, like as I written below, Pacific Island nations. They literally advocated for a moratorium until there's more understanding about environmental impacts. I think 20 member nations have publicly advocated for a moratorium because there's not currently scientific consensus over deep sea mining. There's not a regulatory framework. But richer nations like China and Norway that want to, for like economic gains, have wanted to expedite deep sea mining to secure critical minerals for things like the tech race. Okay, so I think these are all really important things for everyone to know when it comes to the topic. And I think that has intersections in like AF debates because you can write mining advantages or disads because of the mining disad or counterplans and PICs or even critiques because a lot of core critiques are about sort of mining and its impact on indigenous communities, etc. Which is now. So basically there are three main core negative arguments that I've seen on the critical side of the UNCLOS half of the topic. So first is settler colonialism. There's this one really good card. It's called the Wilson 21 card. I think I cut this at like camp, and I put the title on the slide. It's one of the better call links, I think, on this topic. And it is about how UNCLOS sort of leads to the mapping of things like marine borders that are directly like in violation of or opposite of like indigenous ways of relating to the ocean and indigenous like ways of place, the land, ocean, etc., which are probably bad and lead to things like the retrenchment of the nation state, would directly lead to things like genocide. It's the same logic that European colonizers used to sort of craft borders in the New World when they came, which is a pretty good link to the to Sequel. It's about how UNCLOS is an international body or an organization that curates projects to disavow indigenous rights to marine space, and how it sort of uses the nation state to reassert rights to like things that don't belong to them. Another critique that I really like on this topic, that might be a little bit more non-unique, is the CAPK. I think that there are links about things like resource accumulation, material links, but a lot of these are pretty non-unique because it's happening right now, and there's probably not a reason that the United States joining would make it any worse. which is why like it probably like gets beaten by the permutation, but there are good ways to sort of like think about cap length on this topic. Oh, another thing that I wanted to say on the set-call version of the topic is that there are like multiple ways you can pivot in the 2-and-R. There's like good links, so framework and you link you lose is a good 2-and-R, but links could also turn case because sort of the idea of like marine planning and border creating is the idea or is like the same logic that states used to fight over like borders and stuff. So it's like replicates logics of war, etc. So the links could turn the case very easily, which is why I like settler colonialism on this topic. The last critique that I like, or there's like a couple, but really the IRK, which is like all the Agatha Angelou stuff that I think most people are pretty familiar with. It's basically just a critique of like colonial power relations, that international relations is inherently colonial. Maybe you can do some reading on like Edward Said's book, Techno Orientalism, so like post-colonial interpretations of international relations. It's like a very, very big part of the topic, and is very good for like the fiat K. You can just be like, our sort of interpretation of international relations is bad. We should not fiat things within them, and then you can like take that wherever as you will. It's generic but dynamic. There are different flavors of the IRK, and there's like a huge wealth of literature for you to explore. There are also things like managerialism critiques or critiques of extraction. So like Heidegger writes critiques of extraction. There are other authors that do it as well, which could be an interesting literature base to explore. Okay, so now is the ICC. This half of the topic, in my opinion, is a little worse because the ICC is a little bit more powerless than UNCLOS when it comes to doing the things that it was meant to do. Okay, so the first point is that the ICC was established in 2002 by the Rome Statute. There was 124 original signatories. It's governed by the Assembly of States Parties, which elects officials, approves budget, and votes on amendments to the Rome Statutes. The court can only intervene when invited by a state or when the state is unable or unwilling to investigate and prosecute the crimes under its jurisdiction. So basically, when there is like a person who does something really, really bad and what needs to be prosecuted, the ICC can only intervene when another state tells them they can do so. And when the ICC issues an arrest warrant for someone, another state has to come and like physically arrest the person and host them like in their own country. So that's why it's a little bit powerless. The ICC can't like physically prosecute people. They need other countries to do so. And they need like member nations to do so. The court only has jurisdiction to prosecute individuals that are from states that are not signatories to the ICC. So the court can only prosecute individuals. The court cannot prosecute the United States. So like some affirmatives that are like, the United States should join the treaty to prosecute itself is like, that's not how the ICC works. The ICC can only prosecute certain individuals who commit war crimes. But they could also prosecute individuals from nations that are not like signatory to it. So, for example, Israel. Israel has like horrible relations with the ICC, but the ICC has like a public arrest warrant out for Netanyahu, which is why a lot of affirmatives that have like prosecution advantages, for example, are pretty bad because like you don't have to be member or like the people if they want to prosecute people in the United States doesn't have to be member to the treaty in order to prosecute those people. Additionally, the court cannot prosecute crimes committed before 2002. So that is like legally like part of the statute. So it also like restricts affirmative innovation in terms of like prosecuting crimes or like genocides that happened before then, which is a little worrisome. The United States was part of the initial negotiations to create the treaty, but it is not currently a member of the treaty, which informs its like status and gives AF's inherency. Okay. So core auth advantages. Here are some that I've seen and some that I've yet to see, but I think would be pretty cool. So the first advantage I've seen are legitimacy advantages. It basically says that joining the ICC would increase both its credibility and prosecuting individuals, but also the United States' commitment to things like international justice and the rule of law. These are independent, like there are independent impacts to all of these things, but there could also be internal links to hegemony and like a litany of other impacts. Some AFs I've seen say that it is like precisely this ICC legitimacy that is key to punish China for like the Uyghur genocide or Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. And the problem with some of these advantages, like I stated above, is that you can advantage counterplan out of these very easily. Like, and ICC key warrants are pretty bad. And I think the evidence on this issue is like a little bit worse, or the evidence that is like the United States must join the ICC in order to solve the internal links, which is why finding good evidence is like very impressive on this topic. The next type of advantage that I think will be more popular, especially with soft left AFs, are prosecution advantages, which I talked about above. This goes hand in hand with the legitimacy advantages because it basically says that when the United States joins the ICC, it gains enough cred and legitimacy to prosecute specific people, like war criminals or political leaders. The same problem with these, though, is that like it would lose to counterplans that fiat that the ICC does it anyway, or that another country complies with the arrest warrant. The last type of advantages are the IHL or humanitarian law advantages. I think these are slightly better than the first two types of advantages because they are more perceptual and they can straight turn core disadvantages better, like the power projection disad. It basically says that United States' commitment to rule of law will strengthen international humanitarian law globally, and it could resolve like a host of existential threats. There are like cards about why IHL is key to things like broader leadership. And there's also soft left war crime maths, which I talked a little bit about above. Okay. Now the negative side of things, some disadvantages. The first is the power projection DA. It basically says that United States forces would subject certain would be subject to certain prosecutions after we ratify the Rome Statute. It would destroy our military capability in other regions. So the scenario that I've seen the most so far is a scenario about Syria and how US forces there could collapse. This ties into the third disadvantage on the slide, the readiness advantage. But that's sort of about like military capabilities broadly. Maybe it would deter people from joining the military because they would be scared of like being prosecuted. The next one is the Constitution's disadvantage. This one was also on the wealth tax topic, so it should be pretty familiar. But just joining the ICC would be unconstitutional. It would destroy the rule of law, and it would like embolden Trump or something. There's also populism disadvantages that are also about this. It would require like changes to the Constitution, could undermine sovereignty and the rule of law and the Supreme Court, and allow for Trump to do crazy things. There were a couple of scenarios that I saw on the wealth tax topic that I think could be transferable. So there was like a Project 2025 scenario about how it would like embolden Trump to increase policies surrounding Project 2025. But there was also just generally like a democracy collapse one. Okay. So the yeah, and there's also like readiness scenarios about the prosecution of military officials. So the last disadvantage that I kind of really want to talk about is the Israel disadvantage. I think this is one of the best disadvantages on this topic because it is entirely perceptual, and it is about Netanyahu's response to the plan. So basically, the current like stance that the United States has taken on the ICC is that we are like sanctioning them. As of last week, Republicans approved sanctions in like both chambers of the House and the Senate against the ICC because of our relationship, our special relationship with Israel, and how the ICC is like out for Netanyahu right now. And so Netanyahu would supposedly like feel really assured by this. It's like great negative uniqueness for the Disad. And basically, if we joined the treaty, that would destroy our commitment to him, and it would like really confuse him because like we went from sanctioning him last week to joining this week, which would be pretty bad. And then it would lead him to like no longer have faith in the U.S. security guarantee, and then maybe do something like strike Iran. There's like a litany of impacts that you could choose from. Some are transferable over from the WANA topic, but I think this is a pretty good link because it talks about how the perception of the plan would trigger Israeli responses and it would erode security guarantees. And again, it's pretty good considering the United States is currently sanctioning the ICC. So I think something to keep in mind when negating the disadvantages on both sides of the topic is that there's a really good way to sort of manipulate the links to make them entirely perceptual in such a way that like 1ERs will be behind on the time frame debate and it'll be also much harder to straight turn and then you get like a much better turns case argument because if the United States' biggest security commitment, like Israel, for example, started doing crazy things, then it would destroy things like our leadership credibility, which is like the core AF advantage for the ICC half of the topic. So Turn's case, I think, is pretty good, especially with the perception advantages. Okay, now I'll talk about the critique. I think the same stuff for like the counterplan and PICs apply from UNCLOS to the ICC. Advantage counterplans are really good. Okay, so now the critique. There is a wealth of literature about how the ICC is like constitutively anti-Black. It historically prosecutes African officials, is subject to European interpretations of what atrocity crimes are, what genocide is, and basically is subject to this really bad thing called veto powers, where the United States can literally like defer cases if the ICC sends them because they're part of the UN Security Council. And historically, like states in the global south and African states and like states with primarily black and brown populations do not have this luxury. So the ICC ends up prosecuting historically African war criminals as opposed to European ones. This one's pretty bad, and allows for like good link uniqueness um, for like these types of critiques because the United States joining the ICC would legitimize them, embolden them, and give them increased credibility. I think the opposite argument that the United States joining the ICC would like make the United States have less credibility is like not as compelling as uniqueness for these links. Another critique that is like pretty good on this topic is the IRK, which is the same stuff as UNCLOS. I think the links for this half of the topic are a little better because they are about sort of Western colonial powers with relation to like the courts. So again, like I've written before, written below, there's critiques of courts and law that exist. Basically, like every literature base has links to these types of things. So I think the ICC half of the topic is pretty good for the IRK. Since the ICC itself is subject to like things like transparency issues. Juries are often like super biased, and they're not really good at picking them. Litigation takes such a long time. So overall, like the ICC, there's like a good bit of literature about how it is ineffective, but when it is effective in racist ways, which is why I think like critiques are pretty good on this topic. Okay, so that is like the majority of what I will say about the whole topic. There's like it's just like a brief overview, and there's two halves of the topic. So if it felt kind of rushed, that was like my bad, but there's like a lot of literature on this. So if you guys have any questions, I'll be happy to take them now.
Can you explain the IRK more on
Yeah,
ICC?
for sure. So basically the IRK, let's go back to it. Okay. There is this like author, Agatha Angelou. You can like look at a bunch of people's wikis. I think like a lot of people are reading the IRK right now. And it basically says like the structuring logic of international relations is colonial. It is racist. It just sort of predisposed like has a predisposed notion that like nations have the ability to interact with each other in a way that like consistently sacrifices people in the global south, sacrifices people who are like historically not from European countries, and that the process of sort of like talking about international relations absent an interrogation of its like origin, which was through the nature of like colonial states, etc., is really, really bad. I think this sets up like the fiat case super well because it critiques the idea that we can sort of comfortably fiat notions of like the United States joining a treaty. Like, what is a treaty? Like, who has access to those treaties? Who creates those treaties itself? And sort of like interrogates like fundamental underlying assumptions of what a lot of this topic is predicated on, which I think it's pretty good in this instance, since the topic is all about international relations. Does that explain it a little better?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
Can you explain the oil dish ad a little more and what school can I steal it under the wiki?
What school you can? I know Brett's reading an oil ed, so like if you want to, yeah.
Wait,
But the oil
what school
ed,
does it go to?
oh, it's just like a prep group. I don't know, but I can like DM you later. I can like probably find like one. But the oil decide basically says that like UNCLOS would subject us to, or like the United States to climate lawsuits. So basically like companies that want to drill for oil and gas in the ocean would be able to like there would be like lawsuits from environmental agencies and companies, etc., which would be economically disadvantageous for companies to like drill. So it would decrease our oil exports and the ability for us to like produce oil, which is pretty bad. It could lead to things like energy wars over different resources because supply would drop. It could also lead to things like stranded assets. So if you remember from the wealth tax topic, there was a carbon wealth tax act. So like all of that, those impacts from the oil does that apply. Just like lowering oil supply would maybe decrease prices, and then you could read a prices impact. So basically, like the crux of the argument is that there would be lawsuits and like litigation liabilities over it. I think liability disadvantages are pretty good because like joining treaties would subject us to liabilities over the things that we do because there would suddenly be regulations. So there would be oil, like climate liabilities, there would be military liabilities. So if you can find other liabilities disadvantages, it would be pretty good considering that it would be like unique based off of United States like ratification of that specific treaty. Um, yeah.
For the lawsuits, like thingy, can you explain how does joining UNCLOS specific links to like for lawsuits which cause a disad?
Yeah, so it would like there's articles in UNCLOS that would legitimize environmental agencies doing that currently. So like right now there is not like a lot of lawsuits get thrown out because there's not like a stable legal basis for them, but UNCLOS provides them. So it's like a legal issue. Joining the treaty would subject us to those specific regulations provided under UNCLOS and make it easier for companies to like uh, initiate lawsuits versus oil and drilling companies. It's like part of UNCLOS.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
What would
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
you can go, you can go.
Okay. So any good advantage counterplan recommendations? Also, which one is probably like good for the Israel decide?
Advantage counterplans to read what the Israel has had.
Yes, please.
Okay. So I advantage counterplans would just need to resolve app internal links. So it could just be like if apps get their advantages off of prosecuting certain individuals. So for example, like if there's a soft left app that prosecutes policemen or like military officials in the United States, you could read an advantage counterplan that would just like prosecute those people in the United States, but not formally like join the treaty. And then that would avoid the disadvantage because it would not like Netanyahu doesn't care about what we do domestically, and it would resolve the AF internal links. If there was an advantage counter plan that was about like international humanitarian law, there are probably like other policies that the United States could codify, other like diplomatic agreements, or like it could have diplomatic agreements with like China to prevent things like the Uyghur genocide, or like condition something else over China to prevent the Uyghur genocide. So like the United States could join other like diplomatic agreements that would reify or like reinforce humanitarian law rather than having to subject Israel to anything, if that makes sense. So that would avoid the Israel disadvantage.
What are the best responses to the set call K for UNCLOS?
Okay, so basically when I read or like are we talking from the perspective of a policy AF or like a soft left AF? Because I think those things are distinct.
Policy F.
A policy app. Okay, so like framework and extinction outweighs is obviously like always a good option. You could just win that you should get to weigh the plan and that the app would probably outweigh. Another thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that a lot of stat call debaters make the argument that extinction is inevitable to sort of mitigate AF impacts. You should say that extinction is certainly not inevitable, then like right have defense to that, but also keep in mind time frame that the AF would happen much faster than their claims of like extinction being inevitable. Like they would say colonialism causes extinction so far into the future, but like the AF outweighs that time frame. Another thing is you can link turn them. So there is this like tribunal authority called the International Tribune of the Law of the Sea, which is like a organization underneath UNCLOS that member nations sort of like called like they respond to those. And basically it is a new tribune that has ex or like a the possibility for indigenous tribes and organizations to voice their opinions and like their concerns about claims to continental shelves, etc. So I know like a lot of Arctic indigenous tribes sort of respond to these like this thing called ITLOS, ITLOS. So there's like literature about that. You can cut a good link turn about it. You can cut link turns about how the UNCLOS sort of makes nation states cooperate with each other, which means it is like not colonial in the same sense. Cooperation is a good idea because it allows us to sort of like listen to indigenous authority over things like the ocean. But I also think like a lot of things to keep in mind is that these links are largely non-unique. Like UNCLOS exists anyway. There's no reason that the United States having to join the treaty would make things any worse than they already are, which means there's not uniqueness for their links and that the case outweighs. It's try or die for the F.
Well, would that be like kind of ish the same response to CAP? How would you respond to CAP with the
Cap
policy F?
Yeah, cap, like certainly the links are not unique. It's about like mining and which other countries are already trying to do, like China and Norway. And like, yeah, sorry, like other countries want to be economically profitable. The United States joining the treaty would not do that much worse for like capitalism broadly. But I also think that like the cap K, it's a very much a material critique. Maybe it's less like representations focus as I call it is like very material. So the permutation would overcome all of the links because if the alternative somehow like bans deep sea mining or bans these other like economic things, then the permutation would also like ban those things, but the United States would just join the treaty. And then you could have your like external advantage to that. So I think permutations resolve all the links for the cap K like very well.
Thank
Does that
you.
make sense? Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
Could you go back over the fiat K?
Yeah, sure. So the fiat K is basically an argument that says that like the idea of like fiating or scenario planning in the context of things like international relations is unethical and is an unethical way to approach debate because it would lead to us, or like it would do whatever the link argument is. It would lead to us like endorsing a Western colonial conception of what IR actually is. So it is like a critique of us in debate, scenario planning over different countries doing different things. And it was the stuff that I kind of explained at the beginning of this question time about how IR is inherently like Western and colonial and so consistently sacrifices the global South, and why it is unethical to debate over those sort of things. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah. Does anyone else have any questions?
Can the United States like deep sea bed mine like right now?
No. So a lot of like companies have the like technical capability to do that, but they are scared of like legal repercussions. And they're not currently like protected by a lot of things. So and this is like deep sea mining in areas where and like waters where we do not have correct like control over things that are like past the 12 nautical miles off of our coast. So does that make sense in like the areas that are disputed over? So joining UNCLOS would give us more credibility in like negotiating where we can mine, which is important for afterbeats.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, wait. I think people are sending questions in the chat.
Wait, I have like a really quick follow-up. Why is like what's like the impact of deep sea mining except for like I don't know climate change?
The impact of deep sea mining? Okay, yeah,
That's
sure.
good.
It could be like I don't know, like disputes over things like mining. Like if we are allowed to mine, then it would lead to things like more like conflict and disputes and whatever. Biodiversity could be like something independent. So like what I talked about earlier about carbon sinks, and how they like control the internal links, things like biodiversity loss. So that would be pretty bad.
Okay.
I saw another question in the chat. Anti-blackness argument is that the Security Council would veto prosecution of white war criminals, but still prosecute global in crimes committed by people in the global South. Yeah, sure. There's certainly precedent of this. Like I think I've read like a lot of cards. So you can like check my wiki for cards about this. There's like certainly a lot of precedent about it. Like the ICC has like I think like historically prosecuted war criminals in Africa. I think it's almost like up to 70% of their successful arrests, and like they're like successful arrests, there's like not a lot of them. They're pretty bad at arresting people. So yeah, it's like very bad. But there are also answers to it. Like you could say no, the United States joining the ICC would reform it, whatever. But there is very much historical precedent of it. Is there any other questions?
I had one last one.
Yeah.
For the courts critique,
Mhm.
is there any good like school recs on the wiki, or can you just like explain it to me like I'm stupid, please?
I can't think of anyone who's like read one so far. Like I can't. But basically it would be like critiques of current international systems, the idea that like um white Western institutions can prosecute things fairly. The sort of like you know how we critique fairness in the context of like debate. There's also critiques of like what Western courts can actually do. So maybe if you just like look up in Google Scholar like courts, anti-blackness, like Eurocentrism, there's like a wealth of literature about it. And there is certainly like intersections with current like settler colonial understandings of things like courts and how like white countries sort of decide like who is the criminal, like who is not the criminal, different standards of what things like innocent until proven guilty, things like that. There's definitely like criticisms of those things.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Any other questions? Okay, I think that's it. Yeah, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I think I'll just hand it back to Sophie.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for doing this, Sarah. This was actually really amazing and it was really informative, and I think I learned a lot from this actually. I hope everyone else felt the same and everyone else thought they like learned something. Sarah, if you could put your email in the chat in case anyone else has questions and they want to email you, that would be great. Um, and I think if no one else has any like last second questions, or if you do, just like go ahead and email Sarah. Then this concludes our 2025 Jan-Feb topic lecture. Thank you everybody for attending, asking questions, and participating. If you came in late or missed anything, this will be posted on our YouTube like immediately after. And yeah, everyone is free to go. Thank you so much for attending and have a good night. Make sure to thank Sarah because this was a very good topic lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Whatever.